Nearly 30 years ago, the audience took their seats at Sadler's Wells Theatre in London for a brand new production based on Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. There had been a lot of publicity in advance of this show and more than a few rumours swirling around about what to expect, because this was the biggest production yet by a young British choreographer called Matthew Bourne. This production's prince grew up unloved and unhappy, surrounded by stifling protocol. It was immediately striking and funny, and then he met the swans. They weren't the ethereal swans in tutus we're used to. These were all-male swans, bare-chested, shaggy-legged, feral and fascinating. And the arrival of that pack of strange creatures was an electric moment, one of the great stage images of recent decades. 30 years on, Matthew Bourne is Sir Matthew, and his company, New Adventures, tours the world with brilliantly original shows, taking off from classic ballets, films and novels. In 2016, Matthew received the Queen Elizabeth II Coronation Award, the sparkliest honour from the Royal Academy of Dance, so it's a huge pleasure to welcome him to Why Dance Matters, the Royal Academy of Dance podcast. We're shaking things up at Why Dance Matters, just a little, moving to a monthly schedule. Each month, we'll sit down with an inspiring artist, teacher, or someone else whose life has been touched by dance. One guest, one shining conversation every month throughout the year. I'm David Jays, and I'm excited that Matthew launches this new pattern, just as his iconic Swan Lake returns to the stage where it all began. So, Matthew Bourne, welcome to Why Dance Matters, especially as it's almost 30 years since the opening of Swan Lake, which I guess more than anything else is the production that people still associate New Adventures with, that put the company on the map. What do you remember about the opening night, Sadler's Wells, 1995?
It's interesting. We were talking about this the other day, and I was finding out some people who were actually there, you know, and I probably was unaware of all the people that were there. You were there, David.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I was in a sort of real state of, I don't know, I thought I could probably have passed out with the nerves, I think. And I do remember the conductor coming into the pit at the beginning and then walking straight out again. He's actually forgotten his score. No, what I remember about it was the shock of the new in a weird way, or the shock of the unexpected, I would say. And I think the build up to it had been so much about, was I the right person to do a new version of Swan Lake? My company had quite a sort of quirky, humorous reputation, I suppose, in some ways. And the idea of a send-up of Swan Lake, some people were looking forward to and others really weren't, you know. So there was a lot of talk about that. The idea of a male swan was a very difficult thing at the time for people to imagine what that might look like. And I think a lot of people were expecting the Swans and Adam Cooper to come on in tutus, almost like a drag version of what they knew as a dancing swan. And I think they thought that would be the funny part of the show, if anything. You know, that's where the laughs would start. And actually, it was the opposite. You know, there were some humorous moments in the early part of the show with the story of the prince and his girlfriend and royal life and all that stuff, which I thought would be the thing that would be picked up on, actually. We were in the land of Charles and Diana and Camilla and Fergie and Andrew.
All of that, yeah.
Papers every day when we were doing that. I think the image of the swan, when Adam first came on, Adam Cooper, was so unexpected. People said to me before, well, what will you do if people laugh when he comes? Well, I don't think they will. It's not funny. And I think people find it very difficult to imagine. That was an extraordinary moment, something that just was unexpected. And we hadn't leaked anything beforehand, I think. But then Act 3, which is the second half, which is the ball scene, where the swan returns, but as the black swan, in our version, the stranger. That was an act in a studio, which I thought wasn't going very well. I thought, it's just one dance after another. It wasn't really, didn't have any atmosphere in the room. That was sort of electric on the first night. The image of Adam in his black leather trousers and the charisma and the sexuality and everything that was just sort of, again, quite surprising, I think. And it had an electric atmosphere that I was so taken aback by and not expecting. So the whole evening was full of surprises for me and for the audience, I think. So that's what I remember about it.
Are you always surprised when a production first meets an audience? Can you, with time now, predict what's going to happen, or is there always stuff that slightly takes you aback?
The first performance is always the one that I look forward to in many ways, but also am worried about, because that's when you get the first sense of a reaction from people who know nothing about the show. And that reaction tends to stick. It tends to be the one you always get. And you discover so much on that performance. I can never understand directors who sort of hang around in the foyer because they're too nervous to watch. I mean, that's when you learn about a show, or a ballet or whatever it is you're doing, a play. That's when you learn so much. Do they get it? Do they get some of the things? It's clear sometimes whether they do or they don't. Or suddenly they're laughing at something and you think, what are they laughing at? I don't know what they're laughing at. And you realize that something has been implied that you hadn't taken into account. There's so much you can learn. So the first show and the next few shows, the previews, which is again something dance isn't very good at because they're usually not on for very long. It's just a crazy situation where you open on your first show. That's the world we're in. That's where you learn about the piece.
Yeah. And what were you like 30 years ago, Matthew? Were you really ambitious? Were you kind of certain in your direction and what you wanted to do? What was younger Matthew like?
Well, I'm told I was, in a way. I didn't feel that way. I mean, I think what I felt confident about, because I'm often asked, what did you expect the reaction for that piece? And I felt we had a good idea. That's what I felt. I felt confident the idea was interesting and that it was worth doing. And that all of us in the rehearsal room, which was a long rehearsal period in those days, we did like 11 or 12 weeks. It's 4 or 5 if you're lucky, And so I think we all felt nervous but confident that we had something to show people. So it was that kind of confidence, not this is going to take over the world kind of confidence.
Little did you know.
No, it really didn't. And I don't think anyone would have predicted that. But I just got on with what I loved and wanted to do at that time. And I still always have done, actually. I've been very fortunate that I do things that mean something to me and feel strongly about.
And you've mentioned the impact of the Swans. People still today sometimes talk about the production as the all-male Swan Lake, which of course
Yes.
It isn't. But it is very much an all-male flock of swans. I was going to say pack, because that is the impact, isn't it? It's very much kind of feral, very masculine image in the way that a traditional classical ballet Swan Lake is the epitome of feminine identity. Yes. Where did those swans come from? Where did that image come from?
Well, it's a mixture of things. When I first saw the ballet Swan Lake when I was 18 or 19, I was actually surprised at how fast they all moved. I kind of was in my head, I was expecting it to be all lyrical and ethereal and beautiful and floaty and all those things. I remember when they come on with the legs moving in front and that sort of fast entrance that they do in the classical version. I thought, this isn't what I expected. So I already had that in my head, I suppose. And then I got to know the ballet very, very well and saw it many times, usually with Anthony Dowell, actually, as the prince, looking with these faraway looks. I know I'll never marry, I wonder why. That's sort of some ideas in my head, I think, early on about male swans. But I think the image, it's a mixture of things, isn't it? I think it's a mixture of ballet, contemporary movements, much more into the ground, but also the opportunity to look at real swans. It just seemed the obvious thing to do, to watch swans, to look at documentaries about swans, to go and visit St James's Park and watch swans and try and get some movement ideas from swans, not necessarily gliding along the water, but, swans when they're coming into land are a little bit more ungainly, the wings flap backwards and the feet sort of circle in front, and the waddly nature of some of it, or also when they feel threatened and they protecting their young, how violent they can be, or protective, I would say, and strong. So it was all those elements we were able to look at the choreography and bring those to it, whilst keeping a structure, which was the musical structure of Tchaikovsky. And actually some of the groupings that we have in the Act 2 are the same as in the ballet, but with different choreography. So the groupings are mirroring sometimes, yeah.
And the look of them as well, the kind of powdered, bare-chested, very strong, beaky, black line of makeup, the slightly shaggy breeches. It's a really strong collection of visual images as well, isn't it?
Yes. Well, Les Brotherston came up with something which is, I suppose in some ways, if you were to say, what is this creature? It looks like half human, half animal, but then with sort of bird-like qualities. And it's quite the makeup, rather than attempting anything literal at all. It's sort of tribal. And there's a sense of ritual as well, which ballet has, actually, classical ballet, sometimes a sense of ritual of meeting in this place to do this very clearly formed meeting of characters and people. It still had that. So I think it was something that had an essence of several things going on at the same time. I always say to the dancers now, you're a mixture of human, bird and animal mixed together. It's not all about swans necessarily.
Alarmingly, of course, a lot of the dancers in your new company for this revival won't even have been born when the first production was seen. Terrifying thought. But what is that new generation of dancers finding challenging? What are they digging into? How does a group of young people coming in change the nature of the show when you revisit it?
It's extraordinary now. We've just started rehearsals this week, actually, with the Swan. We did principal rehearsals last week, and we've started with the Flock of Swans this week. The female characters join in 2 weeks. The knowledge they come with is so interesting. You know, they've grown up with the piece. As you say, all of them were not alive when I made it. None of them.
Matthew.
There were one or two, but now it's sort of, yeah, it gets worse. And I have to stop them treating me like some sort of character from history walking around the room.
You are Gandalf to their little hobbits.
I have to say to them, please look me in the eye. They come with a lot of knowledge. They've grown up with it, and they have a sort of sense of the movement already a little bit. It's often the piece they've dreamed of being in. You get an amazing atmosphere in the room of this is people's dream show. You can't buy that kind of feeling from a company. All bar 4 of them, there's about 20-something swans we're dealing with, all bar 4 have already shaved their heads, which is a first, actually. Usually it sort of happens in dribs and drabs throughout the rehearsal period, and some resist it right to the last minute. They've all come in like, I want to feel like a swan straight away. You know, so it's amazing, really. And the incredible atmosphere in the room of just happy to be there, you know, is an incredible feeling.
And the way in which dancers amass their technical skills, the technical armoury of dancers has changed over the last few decades, probably in part due to your work and exposure to your work. Does that mean that you revisit the choreography, look at the movement again, just because there are now wider, different capabilities there?
Well, certainly over the years, the choreography's got honed to something we're very clear about now. I think when we started out, we maybe didn't know what we had exactly, and we didn't know as well how to teach it. We were really not exactly throwing it together, but we were creating it as we went along. And now we really know what it is and how to teach it and what the pitfalls are in it and all those things. And so it's become, I think what you're saying in some ways is that the standard of dancing has got better as well, which it certainly has over the years. We've managed to attract dancers from companies all over the world, you know, people who really want to be in this piece. So the level of dance is much higher. The level of dancing talent is higher. But of course, as you say, the dancers are more versatile now. And it's a show that does require people to do lots of different styles of dance. So I try and mix the company with dancers from different backgrounds. So there's some musical theatre people in there, as well as some people from classical background and some contemporary background, because you need those elements there as well. You need the performers for the other acts. And we're not looking for perfect unity. We're looking for people with passion, who really dance with passion. So they don't all have to have the same technique. I said to them all yesterday, you know, this is an extraordinary thing. we are the only company in the world who perform this piece, always have been. But you're coming in 6 weeks, you have to represent that piece. You have to be the masters of this choreography. You are the people who dance it. You are it. Whereas in another company where people have gone through the school or come through a style and they're also, it's embedded in them. They have to get that style in a few weeks. So it's quite a task.
You must have had classical companies come to you over the years and say, can we do your Swan Lake? Can we, or some of the other big classic productions? Have you been always quite protective of not letting them out into the world?
Yes, I've always wanted, well, there was early on in the Swan Lake sort of history, there was talk of reproducing it in other places, like a Broadway show or something, you know, so there's several versions of it happening. I always resisted that. Probably crazily. I could have, you know.
You could have minted it.
Financially, it would have been good, probably. But I always wanted it to feel like a special event. I always wanted it to feel like it was a company, not a show. And we were the company that did it. So I've always felt that I've always protected that. I'm sort of open to looking at it being done with other companies if it's based somewhere where we can't tour to or we don't tour to and it's limited to that city or a small sense of touring. Actually, weirdly, I had an offer to talk about it the other night. That was at the Royal Opera House, and I was approached by a very famous dancer about to become a director. So I'm open to it actually now after 30 years. You know, I think it could happen.
Yeah.
But of course, it doesn't. Most of my pieces don't quite fit into the repertory of a classical ballet company, unless they're open-minded about not having point work in the show and those sort of things. Sometimes that's a prerequisite. There is point work, and we don't really do that.
Was ballet part of your life, part of what you were exploring, part of what you were seeing from early on? How did dance come into your life?
Oh, I think it was always there. My journey is very unusual. I started off doing like little amateur shows and things, learning about dance from what was on TV, old MGM movies. My parents also took me to see a lot of big musicals in the 60s, where there were a lot of big musicals at that time, you know, and I loved all of that and I wanted to recreate those dances. So I sort of became a kind of self-taught dancer through my teen years, putting on shows and little reviews and things. And then I hadn't discovered ballet until, as I say, my late teens. I think I'd went to see Swan Lake just out of self-education. I thought, I've never seen a ballet. I should try one, you know, go and see a famous one. And then I got so hooked into that and went to everything. And I felt that's when I learned how to choreograph, was watching Ashton, Macmillan, all the other choreographers that were coming to London at Sadler's Wells, you know, Twyla Tharp and Cunningham, Roland Petit I really liked. There were lots of choreographers to see. In those days, I've realized as I get into grumpy old age, where I don't like very much at all, I loved everything then. Everything I went to see, every West End show, every ballet, I loved them. There was very rarely did I not like something. It was all going in.
You were kind of feeding yourself, weren't you?
Feeding, and with no really intention of thinking that was going to be my career. It was still in early 20s when I hadn't really trained and decided I should do that. I mean, I was sort of meandering around the West End in various jobs, selling theatre tickets at the National Theatre Bookshop and things like that. I decided, well, it was encouraged by fellow ushers to go and audition for a dance college. And I did. It was literally my first ever dance class was my audition for Laban, now Trinity Laban. And I got in, I think mainly because I was so passionate about dance and watching it and reading about it and all the other things that went with it. And I didn't expect them to think I was a particularly good dancer. Funnily enough, though, at the time, I did think I was quite good. I'd been doing it for a long time. I'd been putting on all these shows and in an amateur way. And I loved dancing, you know, and I'd always done it since I was about 3 or 4. But I wasn't trained. And this was something I needed to do. Very late, though.
Yeah, that must have been quite a shock to the system when you're already, you know, you're established as a person. You're an adult. To suddenly expose yourself.
Yeah.
Quite a vulnerable way to something completely new.
Well, there weren't so many guys around at the time in the college that I went to, and that's changed over the years, I guess. And because I was a little bit older, I was 22 when I started. A lot of my fellow students were like just straight from school, or 18, 19. That little difference of having lived a bit made all the difference, actually, because I felt I was there because I really wanted to be there. Some of them had just gone from one thing to another and it was the next thing, and I felt I had a purpose to be there and I really loved it. I sort of lapped it all up.
And unlike a lot of dancers, especially classical dancers who will have, been in their local Nutcracker production from the age of 10 and been performing ever since, your actual performing career was really fairly short, wasn't it? Because it's around the time of Swan Lake that you are tailing off, I guess. Was it Swan Lake on Broadway was your final rather glamorous bow?
It was, yeah. I hadn't danced for some time, but when that came up, I just wanted to say I'd done it. I had the best schedule of performances on Broadway of any person, 2 shows a week. I did.
Perfect.
Yes, the choreography kind of took over maybe a year or 2 before Swan Lake with Highland Fling, which was something I was intending to be in, was the piece before. A Nutcracker I made actually in 92 without being in it. And then I sort of went into it a little bit later, the next time we did it. I also got the offer to do Oliver, the original production I did in 94. That was why I wasn't performing in Highland Fling, because I had this other freelance job. So it sort of happened because of that. And then I kind of found a whole new way of working, which is very valuable of being able to watch, not be in it, which has made such a difference, so I had to give up the dancing very quickly.
You haven't been tempted to kind of create little Hitchcock type cameos for new shows where you could just kind of duck in?
I think of anything worse. I'm not one of those people who perform at the drop of a hat.
Right.
I think you lose your nerve, After a year or 2 goes by, I think you realize what a big thing it is to get out on a stage and say, look at me, I'm good. Watch me. That's a big thing. And I lost it. And I love doing it, watching through. I feel I'm part of it, of course, when I'm in the audience. I love it. I love feeling part of my shows. But yeah, performing, definitely not.
Are you a happy audience member of your own shows? You don't sit there noticing the 1001 things you wish you could change or that have gone wrong or that aren't exactly as you imagined. You can enjoy them.
I'm known for this, probably, that I always watch. I watch from beginning to end. I don't pop in and out. If I miss the beginning, I probably won't watch any of it. Always want to see the whole thing within the audience, feeling the audience reaction. Mostly, I'm a good audience member. I do enjoy it. I don't just sit there to sort of please myself and just think, oh, isn't it all marvelous? But I do sort of have things in mind. And because we do such long tours, we're doing, performance 200 or something at some point. I like to try and think of some new things to bring to the dancers to keep their minds alive. So we're often changing little bits. We're often adding things. We're often having a new idea about something. And that's what keeps it alive. Ultimately, I do love being there with an audience and feeling them appreciate it. Yeah.
You mentioned Oliver, the Lionel Bart musical based on Oliver Twist. Why do one huge show when you can do 2 almost at once? Because 30 years ago, as you say, you made Swan Lake off the back of working on Oliver in the West End. And this year you're reviving Swan Lake and a new production of Oliver, which opened in Chichester in the summer, is coming into the West End. How complementary is a big Matthew Bourne dance show and a big musical where I guess there are more cooks around the pot?
Yes, they're quite different. I mean, just generally, musicals and dance company shows are very, very different in one sense, in that the performers are of different skill levels, so you have to sort of make it work for all the different skill levels you have within a musical theatre company. And that's, I think, what a good choreographer is in a musical theatre show, is someone who does try and use everyone rather than just, the group of dancers, who dance. That's the difference. But the thing that's the same is trying to tell a story, for me anyway, is pretty similar, of trying to tell a story to an audience. You have a lot more help in a musical because you've got a book and you've got lyrics and, you can be much more specific in that way. Whereas a dance show, you're expressing everything through movement and acting and wordless acting. So they have their similarities and they have their differences. I like working with a team. I do that with New Adventures as well. I have a regular team. And when I was asked to do the new production of Oliver this year, I got my New Adventures team around me. So Les Brotherston designed it. Paulie Constable is the lighting designer. I got Etta Murphy involved as my associate, and Sam Archer, one of my long-standing dancers. And I was surrounded by my people, my team, really. And it does feel a little, Cameron would not like me to say this, I'm sure, but it feels like New Adventures does Oliver a little bit.
Right.
Having said that, one of the thrills of doing the show is that Cameron now has the full rights. He's the full rights owner of Oliver.
And this is, we should say, Cameron McIntosh, the great, I want to say impresario, more than producer.
Okay, love that. But I could work alongside him in developing a new version where I've reordered some of the scenes. We've got a new scene in it. I looked back to the book for some more dialogue. You couldn't have done any of this without Cameron being by your side. You would just be handed a script and this is what you have to do. So we were able to really look at it and play with it, and knowing it lovingly, the two of us over so many years, I think it's part of our DNA, really, Oliver, and certainly was with me growing up. So I feel very connected with it. And with Lionel, who I worked with originally in 94, and the East End thing and the Theatre Royal Stratford East thing that I used to go to when I was a teenager. It feels very much a part of me. So it's a show that's been around my life for a long time.
Yeah. And there are theatre artists who really shudder at the idea of working with children. In Oliver, you're working with loads of children, but I get the sense that that's something that you really enjoy.
I do. I love the charm. If we're talking about movement, for example, I love the charm of a child dancing set choreography, and it always looks a little bit different. It's going to be that particular young person's approach to movement. They're not highly trained dancers. That's so charming. Oliver needs to be like that. Even with the adult ensemble as well, you want a mixture of shapes and sizes and ages and all those things. It has its own charm. It should look natural. The young people in particular, there's something so charming about them attempting the movement and giving it their own swagger. And it's lovely, So I do really enjoy that. It's a different thing, as you say. The results are different, but really lovely to watch.
Has the way you work changed a lot over the last 3 decades? I mean, you've always been really excited by the research you do and that you encourage your dancers to do. But are there any sort of fundamental ways in which you approach work differently, in which the process is a different thing?
I guess over a longer period of time, my physical involvement in creating material, which is in the early days, I used to make it all on my own body and then kind of teach it, which I think most people think is what choreography is or what choreographers do. It's not really true, as you well know. Most choreographers shape the movement with the dancers. The confidence to do that, you need to have gone through the stages that I went through, I think, and where you are making up a lot of movement on your own body. And as your own body starts to not be able to do those things, or you're working with people who are much more skilled than you ever were, you want to use what they can do. The storytelling aspect has become more important to me and more interesting to me, of telling a story over a full evening rather than a short idea, a short piece. I think that's become a bigger thing. And also, I think I expect a lot more from people now. I expect them to be able to deliver these quite difficult acting roles as well as dancing roles. I think that's become an important aspect of the work. But ultimately, I think it's always been about audiences and trying to divorce myself from what I know and placing myself as a person in that audience, watching for the first time and telling them a story without any knowledge. I don't agree with scenarios in programs and things like that. So I want to tell a story to people that they get surprised by or don't really know what's going to happen at the end. That's grown in me. I still love to do that.
And since Swan Lake opened in the year since, you've been knighted, you're Sir Matthew, you've won the Royal Academy of Dance Queen Elizabeth II Coronation Award. There is nothing more prestigious on the planet. So you are, and of course, the head of this wonderfully established company, which on any given night is performing something somewhere and in cinemas and on small screens, So I'm wondering, does the balance of sort of fun and responsibility change when you're that established and you are responsible for a lot of people's livelihoods? Can you still enjoy it in the same way?
There are some things that change and some things that never change. I think I'm surrounded by amazing people who put my shows on for me, who know the work as well as I do, who love the work. And that was the same on Oliver as well as with New Adventures. I'm surrounded by really great people who are all pulling together. And I feel I need that these days a bit as I'm a bit older, and I kind of want that support around me. But there are other things that have not changed that much. And I still take great delight in seeing dancers grab a role, sort of find new things in a role. And that excites me still. I still get really excited about going into rehearsals and seeing new dancers tackle some of these pieces. That doesn't really change. I'm lucky that I love reviving work, I think. If I didn't, then none of this would still be around. I've always loved it because I always feel you can do better.
Yeah.
So I always think there's new things to find. And I find the best people that I've worked with in theatre are like that as well. I mean, I went into rehearsals for Mary Poppins last week, which is another show that's come back after 20 years, and there's Richard Eyre, sitting there redirecting a scene that he did 20 years ago, like it was a new scene, not bearing anything in mind about what had gone before and just doing it with these actors. And I think the British approach is very much like that, I think. Unlike an American approach, which tends to be very drilled, this is it. I think we're very open to new ideas in an old show. And I think that's what keeps them alive.
Matthew, you have swans to wrangle and urchins too, probably, for Oliver. So I will let you go and do both of those things. But before I can do that, I have to ask you one last question. Why does dance matter to you?
Well, to me, that's good. I'm glad you said to me, because then it's personal. I mean, it's my life. I mean, it's the savior for me, actually. From when I was a kid, I thought I was going to be a theatre kid. I was going to act and stuff like this. Then I went through a period where it was very difficult for me in terms of growing up, going very quiet and very sort of, I felt a little bit isolated, and movement was the language which still appealed to me, and I felt I could still respond to and could still find ways to communicate with. So I think for me, it's always been my form of telling a story, my form of communicating with people. I think that's why dance matters on the wider scale, is that it is so totally universal. We all have bodies, we all have faces, we all can connect. As we tour around the world, we make friends very quickly. There's no language barriers. We all understand each other. What brings us together is more important than what can divide us, So I think that's why dance is so primal to all of us. It connects, it communicates. Not always, I have to say. When I was thinking about this question, why does dance matter? I thought, well, not all dance matters. It's a general thing. And I think these days, anyway, for me, as I said, I loved everything when I was growing up. I'm now more picky, and not all dance does matter. But dance generally, I think, has the ability to bring us joy, bring us connection. It communicates in a primal way. I think that's what's so important about it.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure, Matthew. Many congratulations on this anniversary year. Off you go and meet some swans.
I will. Thanks, David. Thanks very much.
A chat with Matthew feels like the perfect way to begin our new pattern of monthly episodes. His production of Swan Lake returns to the UK in November, first in Plymouth, then Salford and London, and then all directions well into 2025. Details are in our show notes, and so are links to the RAD's ever sociable socials. Let us know what you think of this episode, and please do subscribe, like, or review the podcast so that more people can find Why Dance Matters. I really look forward to connecting with you each month as we meet another remarkable person. Our guest today was Sir Matthew Bourne. Why Dance Matters is made by the RAD team of Katie Hagan, Keisha Dodd and Katie Butcher, and our artwork is by Bex Glendinning. And though the podcast schedule is changing, there is one brilliant constant: our producer, Sarah Miles. I'm David Jays. Take care and see you soon.